All right, everybody, make sure to be taking notes as we go through this second chunk of lectures. And this time it's going to be on characterization and point of view. It should only be 2 ed puzzles this time. They might be a little bit longer than the way the other one was chunked, but it just kind of makes sense to do characterization and then point of view. Okay, so here we go. All right, so, characterization is something to help us understand human beings, because the human beings and our human character is infinitely complex, variable, and ambiguous. Remember, we're not here to summarize what a character has done, just like we wouldn't summarize plot summary. We're here to try to analyze the character and to try to find meaning out of who they are and how they think and what they do and all that good stuff, okay? And what I want you to do is show me your insight into how does the characterization of this character help us see some truth about the human condition or about ourselves or some thematic point that's being made. And you need to be able to describe convincingly who a character is if you're doing character analysis and trying to talk about who they are, what are their motivations, and what is the author trying to say through them. Right, as I said, how to illustrate some truth about our human nature or human experience. So again, we're going to talk about commercial versus literary fiction. Let's talk about commercial fiction features of characterization versus versus literary. Commercial fiction characters tend to be more two-dimensional than literary characters. It's not that they can't have some depth, but they tend to be lacking the depth that a literary character was. And they tend to be more stereotypical kind of stock characters. Okay. They're more easily identifiable, clearly labeled as either good or bad. Sometimes there's a little bit of gray with them, but they're not as morally complex and different that would be for a literary figure. Okay. Main characters in commercial fiction tend to be attractive, sympathetic, or at least they're decent human beings that have larger than life qualities. They're kind of people we want to look up to or be like. It's a kind of escapism of I don't like my life and I'm not where I want to be, so we want to escape through them. Literary fiction isn't about escape. Literary fiction is about facing truth, which can be really hard. Okay, so they tend to be likable, attractive figures. Okay. Their vices, or the things that vices are like the opposite of virtue. They're the things they do that are naughty. Their vices can't be too objectionable. Okay, I should say objectionable, not objective. Sorry, typo there. They can be rebellious, but we like a good rebel, right? That's not objectionable. Like if you think about Guardians of the Galaxy, right? We like Star-Lord. He's cute. Some would say he's kind of dumb, but he's adorable. It's kind of his, charming feature. And yeah, he's a thief, but he's a good thief, and so again, we want to live vicariously through these characters, as I said, and vicarious means we want to live through them. And the aim of in commercial fiction for their characters is to carry the plot forward, just to entertain. Okay, they aren't getting us to question. Okay, now here's an actor that does a lot of definitely complicated characters, right? He's played the Joker, which is definitely not. You're supposed to be sympathetic of him, kinda, but also, oh my goodness, he's horrible. So in literary fiction, characters aren't necessarily attractive, but they can be, but they tend to be more not necessarily special in that way. And they're less able to be pigeonholed or labeled as a kind of stock stereotypical character. And sometimes they can be very unsympathetic or despicable even. In fact, there's a book you might read next year called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where the main character, McMurphy, that you're following, he's kind of sympathetic. You do like him. You do feel bad for him, but you're also disgusted by him. He's not a good man, even though he does some good things. So we are sympathetic for him eventually, but he's done horrible things, and he starts off the book and the film and the play version of the book in jail because he did some horrible things that most of us would find morally reprehensible. He's violent and not a good guy. So he's got a mixture of that good and evil. So a lot of times in literary fiction, you're going to have more complicated characters. That's hard to label them as good guy, bad guy. But that makes them more real, right? We are a mix of those things. We are hard to label and pigeonhole. I mean, we like to label people maybe, but that's not really fair or accurate. That's because those people don't know you if they try to put you in a little box. We're way more than any label could possibly be slapped on us. And we're more likely to be empathetic and understanding if we have a more lifelike character than we would maybe for a kind of a perfect character. So there's even commercial fiction characters where the character is so perfect it's hard for us to connect with them. We tend to actually be more drawn to characters in an existential way that are flawed because we're flawed. We know we're phony, or that we're liars, or that we, cheat on homework, or whatever it is. We have these things that we feel guilty about. And when we feel like we're not the only one, that we're not the only devil in the room, it can make us feel kind of sympathetic for them because we're sympathizing for ourselves, So it's more of a feeling seen and understood rather than escaping, right? It can be. Because characters that, like Mary Sue is a character that's so perfect, a female character that's so perfect, they seem kind of like unattainable, as like, I can't be like that, it's too perfect. Kind of like, for example, in the last Star Wars trilogy, the main character, forget her name right now, she was called a Mary Sue because she didn't have to struggle like Luke Skywalker to find her powers and to become at the level of a Jedi, and he had to really struggle and learn, and we kind of go with him, and we're, because almost nothing comes easy to most of us, right? But for her, she just seemed to be immediately a level 12 out of 10 Jedi master without any training, and she's super special and just came out of nowhere, and that's not as interesting as someone who has to fight for it. Prince Charming is just such a shallow character, this perfect kind of non-person entity that doesn't exist, right? Or like a manic pixie dream girl kind of character. So with literary fiction, right, we get to see more of their inner lives usually, and we can learn from them because of that. It's a lot of times literary fiction tends to be more about that internal struggle than just having this man versus man fight. It's all about that internal turmoil, and we get to learn from them through their inner world, their inner life, right? And if you've seen the movie Fight Club that this is from, or read the book Fight Club that this is from, you'll understand what I mean. But if not, I'm not spoiling it for you. And again, ask your parents, because it isn't a rated R film. But in any case, we get to know people better and understand them better, and that makes us have more empathy, more mercy maybe, and more understanding of why that person did those things, and we're going to be more connected to them. And because the aim of literary fiction is to help us explore our own human psychology individually and as a whole, and to understand why we do the things we do, or why others do the things they do. It helps us grow as human beings in understanding one another. So in the box, show me your understanding. Describe the difference in characterization between literary fiction and commercial fiction. All right, so continuing. So some things to look out for when you're trying to analyze characters and try to figure out what meaning the author's trying to get across through their struggles. And there's some things to think about. There's direct versus indirect presentation or characterization. Direct characterization or direct presentation tells us who the character is. There's no work from the reader unless there's some irony present and they're not being literal, they're being sarcastic, right? So if I said, that's, that guy's an angry man, you don't have to do any work to go, oh, so he's an angry man. You told me, right? It's showing. It's telling, not showing, right? And so that's that. And both literary and commercial fiction do this. You need to. Commercial fiction tends to more heavily do this one, as compared to literary fiction. It tends to be the other kind, which is indirect characterization, where the author is showing you a bunch of clues about them through what they say, think, how they affect others, their actions, and their looks. And you have to take all that evidence, put it together, and try to make a judgment on your own. The narrator or the storyteller, the way that it's written, is not going to tell you the judgment that you should walk away from. You have to figure that out on your own and make that decision for yourself, just like we do in real life. We get to know people by what they say, how they think when they tell us, or the clues that we feel like we know how they think, right? Just by having conversations with them, how they affect others and how they affect ourselves, right? And what they do and how they look. We take all those clues and we make our judgments of other people with the information that we have. It's just more realistic in how we get to know people. And that makes us more connected to the characters, and they make them more real, right? And it's less insulting to the reader for you to try to make up your own mind what you think about that character, just like we do in real life. So here's an example of what I mean. And by the way, steal is a way for you to remember the 5 things to be thinking about for indirect characterization that you could be looking out for when you're analyzing. When a character says something or thinks, we get to hear their thoughts some way, or how they, affect other people, actions and looks. So just think steal, right? But here's an example that has multiple elements of steal to help us make a judgment. So, feeling defeated, Alice nodded weakly as she walked away with tears in her eyes. Okay, so we can see her thoughts inside, that she's feeling defeated. And then we have that, how she's holding herself, right? Her actions and her looks, she's nodding weakly. So that judgment of weakly shows that she's kind of that given up feeling, right? That defeated is coming out more. And the nodding is like, okay, she's kind of accepting things. And then she's walking away with tears in her eyes. Okay, that's clear body language that she's devastated, right? So we could say that maybe Alice is a sensitive person who is struggling to get over this moment of defeat, whatever it is about, right? And that we could probably relate when we have felt that way. So, right, we have several things. We've got thinks, actions, looks, all in this one sentence. Okay, and it helps us make judgments about them. There's lots of things we could maybe conclude from it. So again, with direct presentation, it does have advantages and costs. The advantages are it's clear, it's economical. You don't need to talk a lot and just boom, you're telling us something about them. But good writers only do this a little bit, as much as is necessary, because it does have less of emotional impact. Telling you about somebody is not the same thing as you getting to know them and figuring it out for yourself, right? And most authors follow this axiom of show, don't tell. In fact, when we start writing personal narrative essays this year, I'm going to push this hard, that you show me what happened. Show me what you're thinking or how you're feeling. Don't tell me, right? That's going to have way less emotional impact, okay? And it gives a more realistic impression of a living, breathing human being when they do this, okay? So they don't want to do direct. They want to do indirect, right? And it tends to be dramatized, like acted out, so we can kind of see the emotions in our imagination, right? So show me your understanding. What's the difference between direct and indirect characterization in fiction? And how are they presented differently? What do you need to look out for? Okay, continuing. So some things to look out for, okay? There's 3 things. Consistency in the characterization. Sure, characters can change, but it must make sense. The change in their personality, their outlook, their behavior, it needs to be logical and make sense. If it doesn't, there's something to say there, right, about that characterization. And if they are consistent, that makes it a more believable story. Their motivations, why they do things, should make sense. It should be understandable and believable. Otherwise, it pulls you out of the story and you lose that emotional impact. And plausibility. You want to be able, the author needs to be able to convince the reader that the character could have existed. There's this thing called when you get absorbed into a book or into a movie or a TV show, it's called suspension of disbelief. Because like if you're watching Star Wars, of course that's nonsense and not real and you know it. But if you're watching it and you get absorbed into the story, right, you stop questioning that reality. You just accept it and you just go into it. It's kind of like when you have a dream. When you have dreams and you're in them, they seem to make sense, but and you don't question anything usually. But when you wake up, you think, why would that scare me? That was crazy. That doesn't even make sense. And you try to tell someone what happened in the dream and it's completely incoherent, right? Because you've woken up. Our brains are able to do this magic spell of letting go of reality, but it can be broken with bad writing, right? And so some other kinds of characters we can be looking out for in the hows of your ARNs are flat characters. Those are those 2-dimensional characters that we only know 1 or 2 things about them, or they only have 1 or 2 predominant traits. They're kind of shallow, right, and flat, and they can be summed up in a sentence or 2. Now, they could be stereotypical characters or stock characters, like those are characters that once you see them, you know exactly what role they're going to fulfill, like when I was younger, I remember noticing a lot of movies tended to have, for kids, tended to have kind of like the more attractive, popular kind of leader of the group. And then there was the chubby best friend or good friend that's kind of the clown, right? So that funny friend that was chunky tended to be this kind of stock character, as unfair as that may be. Like if you've ever seen Goonies, you've got Chunk, or if you've seen The Sandlot, they have a character like that. And gosh, I can think of, just off the top of my head, those are the ones that really stick out, but that tended to be like a kind of a common thing. Or you might be like the Wicked Witch, everything about them. That's why Wicked, a lot of people love it, because they break the stereotype, right? That's more literary. It's interesting. It's getting us to think about our judgments of others and thinking we know everything about someone because of like just looking at them, right? That's way more interesting. Now, stock characters and stereotypical characters, flat characters, those are all important, of course, for our minor characters. They tend to be minor, right? But main characters shouldn't be like that. If they are, it could be some weak writing going on, or it might just be more commercial fun stuff, not that deep literary. There may not be a lot of meaning in it. Because think about it. Almost everybody that we come across in our lives are going to be, we only know one or two things about them at most, and they're minor characters in our lives. We don't know much about them. So it makes sense. Not everybody can be a star with a bunch of attention. You wouldn't be able to focus. You are the protagonist of your life, right? But people you barely know, those are those flat characters, minor characters in your life that could become major, but not right now. You also want to be, so you would want to be comparing them with round characters, right? Round characters are more complex. They're deep. They have more three-dimensional qualities. They feel more real. We know a lot more about them, like from all those steel attributes, right? And they tend to be more the major characters, and they're less classifiable because of that. We can't just slap a label on them because we know more about them. They're more, shaped. But we do need both to have a convincing story, okay? So it's not necessarily a commercial versus literary fiction thing. But remember, when you're analyzing these, you're always thinking like, what meaning am I getting out of this character being flat versus this character being round, or this character being a stereotypical character? Especially when authors break that, like with Wicked. You take the Wicked Witch and you break that mold, that stereotype. The author's saying something through breaking that mold of that cliche that we tend to have understood through other stories. And you also want to look out for, are there any static characters? Those are characters that stay the same. That's what static means. There's no real change, right? Or is this character a developing or dynamic character? You could call them either one, either developing or dynamic. I tend to use the word dynamic in class, so just be warned. And those are characters that change. They have some kind of meaningful change in their outlook, their personality, or their character, right? They grow as a human being, or they regress. You can, regress. You don't have to always grow. Some characters get corrupted and get worse, because isn't that true in real life? We're always changing. Tomorrow you're a different person. The next day you're even more of a different person. The next day even more of a different person. But can you go from being a good person to a corrupted person? Absolutely. Remember the Ring of Gyges, right? And it could be a large or a small change, right? But in that shift, it's always in the shift, the changing, the twists and turns, that you can find so much meaning, pay dirt, okay? And as I said, it could be positive or negative, okay? Yeah. So another one you could think about the difference between a character that was an archetype and got changed was Maleficent. In the cartoon of Sleeping Beauty, she's just, this evil sorceress who's a jealous jerk. But then the live action version of it, we get to see a much more developed character and have pity and mercy, and we understand her motivations, and that she's not so easily labeled as evil anymore, right? Even if she's done bad things. Anyway, so static characters, there's no change, right? They're the same from beginning to end. Whereas those developing characters, they change usually through an epiphany. And that epiphany is some kind of either spiritual or philosophical or, moral insight into life and into their own circumstances that usually causes this huge change in them, right? They have this light bulb go off and they can never go back, right? They can't unlearn what they have learned. I don't know if you guys read Oedipus Rex last year, but, when Oedipus finds out that he's not a good guy that he thought he was, everything changes. And it's when he realizes the truth that he's not the good guy he thought he was, he becomes a wiser person and has to kind of be honest with himself and try to be the best person he can with the facts that have come to light. And that turning, that turning in the story, that especially if there's a reversal of fortune that happens because of it, it's called a peripeteia. That's just a Greek term for this reversal of fortune, this turning. Okay, you don't need to know peripeteia right now, but epiphany for sure. You want to be looking out for, do any of the characters seem to have this awakening that makes them understand the world or themselves in a new way? Pay dirt. That's where a lot of the meaning of the whole story is probably in. Okay, that's a big one. And again, to talk about convincing changes, there's 3 conditions, and it's like the other one. That change needs to be consistent for the dynamic character. It needs to be sufficiently motivated, and but there also needs to be sufficient time. So that's a little bit different than the other 3 that I talked about. So it needs to be consistent. The change needs to be consistent with who they are as a person. It needs to be sufficiently motivated. It needs to make sense, like why they had that change. If they just change out of nowhere, it's hard to find what the meaning could possibly be from the story. And it needs to have enough time for it to be believable and for it to have that verisimilitude, that believability. Okay, now not all protagonists change. There's a movie called The Big Lebowski. Again, ask your parents if you're interested in watching it for permission. But The Big Lebowski is actually breaking that, where the protagonist, because usually protagonists change in some way. Not in this story. He's the same old dude from beginning to end. So what might the Coen brothers, the directors and writers, be trying to say about some people, or the fact that they don't change at all, that they go through all these traumas and trials and tribulations and they just go home the same old person, right? Are they trying to say something about being stubborn, or about maybe resiliency, that you can go through things and still come out unscathed? Hard to say, something to argue, right? And that's the whole point. So show me understanding. What are the differences between static and dynamic characters? Use any movie or book or story that you can recall and name that static character and a dynamic character to help explain how they were static or dynamic. It's kind of a big one, but please put that in the box for me. All right. So the main takeaway, you guys, is when analyzing stories for characterization, you need to ask yourself these questions. In view of all the aforementioned matters here, of all the different kinds of hows, all the different literary devices and things to think about, what do you think the author apparently wishes us to think and feel about this character and what happened to them, right? What do they want us to learn about ourselves or about some aspect of life through these characters, right? We're not judging them just to judge them. We're judging them to judge ourselves and to figure out some truth to help us have our own epiphany about ourselves. Okay, it's always about meaning. Remember that. I can't say it enough. So that's the end of part 1. Meet me in part 2 when you get the chance to take notes and continue on. See you in the next one.